Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Charlotte Garraway, a senior manager in Schneider Downs' credits and incentives practice. Tax credits and incentives often have a mystique around them, which makes these opportunities unclear and often underutilized by taxpayers. Failing to understand the requirements and timing for these incentives often precludes taxpayers from taking full advantage. The manufacturing industry has seen significant impacts from rising energy costs, and many in the industry are missing out on opportunities within the tax credits and incentives realm. Today, I am joined by Steve Worth and Dave McGuire to help alleviate some of the mystique around these benefits. Steve Worth is a shareholder within Schneider Downs' state and local tax practice. Steve, do you mind giving us a little bit of your background?
Thanks, Charlotte. Yes, as Charlotte mentioned, I'm Steve Worth. I lead our state and local tax practice at Schneider Downs. I have extensive experience in many of the state and local tax incentives that apply to manufacturing companies, including traditional incentives and some of the things we'll talk about the buried incentives that sit within the sales and use tax code.
Thanks, Steve. We appreciate you giving us a little bit of your intro there. We're also joined by Dave McGuire, who's a shareholder with McGuire Sponsor. Dave, do you mind giving us a little bit of your background?
Thank you, Charlotte. I'm a little bit different than probably most of the people on this line because my background is actually in engineering originally. I started my career in engineering and I have a degree in engineering, but I've been working in the tax area for 27 plus years now, specifically starting my career with depreciation law and other things, and then really getting more and more involved in deductions and credits for energy efficiency and energy systems as those have been added to the code over the years.
Thanks, Dave. Well, I'm very excited to chat with you both today and learn more about some of the credits and incentives that are going to be applicable to the manufacturing industry. So let's go ahead and dive on in. Steve, I know you mentioned that there are many credits and incentives for taxpayers to consider, and there are certainly frequent changes to these requirements which can make them even more complicated and complex to claim. How can businesses best identify which credits they might be qualified for?
Thanks, Charlotte. The best advice I can give is first, realizing that the incentive process starts very early in the capital expenditure process, even as early as several years before you undertake the project, when you just have a line item on your capital budget. This is because the qualification process for many of the credits and incentives available starts very early before the purchase. Once the asset is purchased, the opportunity to obtain and negotiate a credit often has passed. Second, the piece of advice I'd like to give is making sure you have someone that's qualified and really understands these credits to help you move through the process. Many of these credits, in addition to needing to be identified well before the asset purchase begins or the manufacturing begins, also have some very difficult requirements that if they're not followed to the T can disqualify you from that credit. So Charlotte, really the second thing is making sure that you have somebody that knows what they're talking about, like the folks on this call, to help you through that process.
Specifically to the manufacturing industry, are there particular credits and incentives that you've seen be really successful for your clients in this area?
Yeah, Charlotte, when it comes to manufacturing, I lump these incentives into three categories. First, those related to the development of your manufacturing facility, including both the building and the machinery that goes in it. Second, those related to the manufacturing process itself. And third, those related to what is being manufactured. Well, Dave will touch on the facility and the equipment and a lot of the energy considerations. It's really the second of the three, those related to the manufacturing process itself, that I see folks tend to miss, often because they're buried not in the credits and incentives portion of a state's methodology, but because they're buried within the sales tax law, and they show up in the form of exemptions. And really what my state and local tax team does is we help folks that are putting manufacturing investments in place, again, whether it's a facility, equipment, or machinery, to look at the process and understand what qualifies for manufacturing exemptions. What we find is often folks take a much too narrow view of what qualifies as an exemption, and simply having my team talk to you, understand your processes, walk your manufacturing floor, and really understand what you're doing. We can find kind of all of those hidden items and hidden costs that really should have been exempt. Another common mistake is simply not understanding that some of the components of your manufacturing, such as your energy and utility bills, can also qualify for these exemptions and these credits. Doing a study as simple as a prevailing use study that's looking at how much energy consumption your manufacturing process consumes and looking to get that exempt from taxation. A study like that can save companies thousands, hundreds of thousands, sometimes even millions of dollars. So, Charlotte, it really is looking into the non-traditional incentives, maybe within the sales tax, that I see folks get a lot of benefit from.
Those are some fantastic points there, Steve. So certainly a lot of credits and incentives that are often overlooked by our clients, and some areas where, with engaging with your state and local tax team, they can find some great savings right off the bat. To switch gears here a little bit, Dave, we partner with your team at McGuire Sponsel for a few credits and incentives that are especially pertinent to this industry. And so for clients that are looking to get some energy tax credits and incentives savings, what are some of the major incentives that you would see as beneficial?
Charlotte, thank you for the question. Now, the first thing that comes to mind is the 179D energy efficient building deduction. Now, this is a nice area for taxpayers to look at in the first round because it doesn't always require doing something you wouldn't have been doing anyways. So 179D, the history of that, it goes back to the Energy Policy Act of 2005. So it's getting pretty old now. It's a 20-year-old tax law. And what it says is if you build a building to certain energy requirements, you get to take a deduction against the basis of that. And that deduction is anywhere from $1 a square foot up to $5 a square foot if you pay what's called prevailing wages for the construction. Now, that is also indexed for inflation. So right now it's even higher than that. It's about $565 if you meet the full deduction. And what it requires is you have to show that your building is more efficient than an energy standard. Now, this is where it gets a little bit policy wonky, Charlotte. I can go in and say, okay, the standard is ASHRAE 90.1-2007. Nobody really cares about what ASHRAE is. It's the American Society of Heating, Air Conditioning Engineers. But the point being is that you have to be 50% more efficient to get the full deduction. But that deduction is based on a 2007 regulation. So most people are hitting that anyways when they're doing upgrades to their buildings. And what this amounts to is if you hit it, you get to take that deduction against your square footage. So if you get the full $5 a square foot, let's say, and you renovate to make a 100,000 square foot manufacturing facility more efficient, that could be a $500,000 tax deduction you would get to take on your return.
Those are certainly some exciting numbers for folks, right? Especially if it's a project like that where they're already kind of undertaking the work and it's just a kind of an easy add-on, if you will, once you know that it's available. In terms of some of the factors, would you just say, Dave, that kind of anytime anyone's doing a project, it's worth reaching out to kind of ask some questions? Or what are maybe some of the factors that you would say this is the time to reach out and ask and see if 179D is a good option?
So, Charlotte, since 179D is tied to expansions or renovations of buildings, it's really when you're doing an energy upgrade to the building, or if you're building a new building or expanding on a building or doing some type of substantial renovations. Similar to when you would be looking at a cost sig study or something else, you really want to be seeing that you're doing some changes. Now, the important thing is to reach out to a company like Schneider Downs, who understands your entire tax situation. Because it might be that you might hear from somebody, hey, you put in new lights, you get this 179D deduction. Well, if they call you, Charlotte, you might say, you don't need a 179D because we can already take bonus on those lights because it qualifies as qualified improvement profit. So that's why it's important that they're working with a company like yourself that knows how to look at this holistically and make sure somebody's not paying for a deduction that they would be getting anyways.
That's fantastic advice, Dave. We certainly appreciate it, right? We obviously want to always engage with our clients and others just to make sure that we're getting all of those I's dotted and T's crossed and looking into all those different pieces that can help make these credits and incentives make sense. Another area that we get a ton of questions about, I know that we talk about fairly frequently, is going to be around solar panels. Certainly something that I know a lot of manufacturers are looking into to see if they can add those to help offset some of those rising energy costs. What kind of credits and incentives might be available for folks considering those?
So, Charlotte, although people think this is a new area of tax law, there have been credits for solar panels for decades now at this point. But they've changed drastically over the last couple of years, which is why you're seeing this new influx of it. So when we talk about solar panels, we're typically talking about Section 48 of the tax code or 48E. Now, do anybody listening to this need to worry if they qualify under 48 or 48E? No, they don't need to worry about it. It's just a change in the way the regulations were written after the Inflation Reduction Act a couple years ago. Really what it amounts to, though, is if you put solar panels on your building, the base credit for most people starts at 30%. But it's almost like we're watching an infomercial. It keeps getting better. And I always say, but wait, it gets better, because you can get another 10% credit if you're in what's called an energy community. So I know a lot of the Schneider Downs folks are right around Pittsburgh. Well, a lot of Pennsylvania is considered an energy community, a lot of West Virginia, some parts of Ohio, some parts of different states, depending on what happens. That then takes your credit from 30% to 40%. But wait, it gets better. Because if you use domestically sourced content, you can get another 10%. So now you're looking at potentially a 50% credit. Now, not everybody qualifies for that full 50%, but if we start at the 30% credit, that's still very beneficial. And then on top of that, you get depreciation deductions. And the way that works is a solar panel is considered 5-year personal property. Now you reduce your basis by 50% of your credit taken, and then you get to deduct that. If they bring back bonus depreciation, that would write it off right away. So on a $100,000 system, let's say you get a $30,000 tax credit, but then you still get to depreciate $85,000 potentially over 1 year at a 30% tax rate. That's going to lead to getting over 50% of the benefit back from the federal government in year one. That's why you're seeing such a big push to the solar industry. But that also works even if you're putting in geothermal systems or if you're putting in wind systems. Anytime that you're putting in some type of alternative energy property, they should be calling you and asking about it, because there's some great opportunities within that.
And I know some of the fears around this too, Dave, obviously a lot of this legislation or improvements to this legislation came out of the IRA or the Inflation Reduction Act. And that has certainly been a hot topic, in the press in Washington, something that is, kind of being looked at as, is this going to stay? Are these credits and incentives going to still be here 6 months down the road? And certainly some fear from taxpayers around, creating a tax strategy or planning to use these to offset expenses if the credits might not be available later on. So can you speak to that a little bit and kind of what you're hearing in regards to some of the changes that may or may not stay around from IRA?
Now, I'm going to caveat this by saying none of us fully know. There's not been any tax bill that we can look to that's been written and is in writing. Now, what we can also say, though, is a lot of where we've seen investment going in related to the IRA tends to be in states that voted more red. And so that is going to make it hard for people to pull back. And typically when we've seen tax bills, they don't tend to be punitive on a regressive standpoint. So what I mean by that is somebody that starts something, typically when we see a change where something's removed from the tax code, they grandfather people that have already started down the process, because no one wants to go into a business and say, those solar panels you started installing 6 months ago, we're not going to give you the credit for that, even though that was part of your business plan. So the expectation is, even if they change this drastically, that if you start construction of it, you'll probably be grandfathered in. Additionally, Charlotte, this is not something that is new. As I mentioned, the credit for solar panels has been around for decades now. And so this is something that's gone through different administrations, and it's been something they've pushed. Now, could it change? Yes. Do we expect it to change? We're not really 100% sure. And until we actually see a final tax bill, it's almost impossible to know.
Thanks, Dave. I know we all wish we had that crystal ball, but we appreciate your insights there to the best of your ability. So one kind of last area that I wanted to touch on today, I know that we've obviously talked about a ton of credits and incentives here that are applicable to the manufacturing industry. And unfortunately, we just don't see as many folks as maybe we would expect, right? There's tons of folks that are taking advantage of these, but there's tons of folks that we're seeing that aren't. And so, Steve, do you have a feeling for, maybe why some of these credits and incentives are not, as utilized in the manufacturing industry, and how people can really help leverage these to the best of their ability?
Yeah, Charlotte, it's really the two things I mentioned prior. Number one being not having an awareness of these incentives. There's really a lot of different incentives out there, both at the federal level and at the state and local level. So it's hard to really map those out and keep track of them, especially if you're not dealing with them day to day. So that's why it's of the utmost importance to get somebody involved with this process. Again, like the folks on this call that really live in these credits and really understand them and can help, identify your fact pattern and apply credits and incentives to them. The second one is just not taking advantage of these credits and approaching these credits early enough in the process. A lot of folks have implemented their capital structure, maybe made purchases already, and then start to think, wow, that cost a lot of money. What credits and incentives are available? And if you're doing it at that point, for the majority of the time, you're too late. It really has to be credits and incentives being a hand-in-hand process with your capital spend and your planning process, throughout this. So it's really important that if you have manufacturing spend, energy spend, etc., that before that spend even happens, that you're getting folks involved and really thinking about how you can have these credits and incentive savings.
Steve, Dave, thank you both for your time today. And for those of you watching, we appreciate your engagement with this topic. If you have any questions regarding potential credits and incentives that might benefit your organization, please do not hesitate to reach out to our team at Schneider Downs. We welcome the opportunity to discuss these benefits with you and see what might be a good fit for your organization.